Hey everyone, it's Sukhinder Singh Cassidy. I am delighted to be here with all of you at the Marketplace Conference and hope you've had a great first day and a half. I think we're going to spend the next 30 minutes together talking about what it means to scale yourself and your teams as you navigate kind of the journey ahead as a growth CEO or growth executive. And so what I'd really love to do is spend a little bit of time sharing sort of some of the secrets I've learned in my time as a CEO over the last 10 years, and then take your questions at the end, just for sake of ease, but hoping we have time to answer many of them. So with that, we'll get started. A little bit about me for those of you who I haven't met or I don't know. My name is Sukhinder Singh Cassidy, and most recently I was the president of StubHub. So running that marketplace for eBay for the last several years before selling it this year in February to Viagogo for $4 billion. I'm also the founder and chairman of theBoardlist, which many of you may know is another marketplace. It's a talent marketplace that really connects companies with diverse executives for their boards. And in my prior life, have participated on the boards or as an investor or an entrepreneur in many different marketplaces. I served on the board of TripAdvisor for 7 years as a travel marketplace, and I'm currently on the board of Upstart, a fintech marketplace, and also was the founder of a video commerce startup almost 10 years ago called Joyous, also a commerce marketplace. So spent a lot of time in marketplaces as an investor, CEO, and executive. What I thought I'd do, though, as we talked about, is really start by giving you some of the things that have stuck with me from early in my career when I was an executive at Google and responsible for sharing or for scaling the international business, and then into my time as a CEO and what rules sort of carried over as I became an entrepreneur again, and then a CEO of an at-scale marketplace. So I always talk about this as sort of being the diary of my thoughts as I go along and how I think about creating a team that scales and really scaling myself. So the first thing I want to do is really debunk what I think of as very traditional wisdom when it comes to the Valley, which is the wisdom that if you're up and to the right, you're all good. And we all know the up and to the right curve. We think about it when we grow our companies. But I would submit that there's also an up and to the right framework we have when we think about scaling ourselves. You know, we've been taught to believe by the Valley that the founder reigns supreme on the entrepreneurial aspects of running a company, and that a quote unquote a professional CEO comes in when you need to sort of bring in executive chops. And so there's this notion of a journey from founder to CEO. And I think when we think about scaling ourselves and how we operate with our teams and our companies as they scale and grow, I'm not sure this traditional wisdom really serves us very well, because it sets up a paradigm that I think is rather untrue when it comes to how you really operate as you scale your businesses and teams. So the first thing I want you to do is really let go of some of this traditional wisdom about what are the responsibilities of a founder or a CEO. Instead, the way I thought about my own journey, and I would say in almost any company I've been at, whether it was Google, whether it was my own startup, or whether it was StubHub, I really have thought about the journey of a leader as one that looks far more like a sine wave than it does like any sort of up and to the right curve. And not only does it look like a sine wave, it looks like what I would call operating range. So what is it that I mean by operating range? I think that the job of any leader is actually not to play one role or the other, but to know which role to play when. And when you think about leaders who scale, they don't scale because they stay in just one quadrant. They often scale because they, I would say, develop and attune themselves to what their companies need from them from any point in time. And people who do this well are leaders who can operate, you know, when a company is small, they're leaders who can help take a company all the way through its journey. And they're leaders who are effective because they're multifaceted. So let's take a look at this slide for just a moment. As I noted, sort of there's a competency range from being what I call entrepreneurial to executive. There's a knowledge range from having knowledge of the details up to the vision of the company. And at any point in time, the job of a leader is to actually know where in these quadrants you need to skate to. The obvious question is, do you need to be good at everything? And the answer is no. Many of us have a natural place on a graph like this where we, operate at our best. And we'll talk about that in a moment. There'll be other areas where we don't operate well, but our job is to navigate to those areas and to, in some cases, dive deep. And if we can't ask the questions ourselves, get the right question askers in a room. Often our job as a CEO is to ask the questions ourselves. And, and one day we want to come in and put on our professional CEO hat and pull ourselves up out of the weeds because we need to go raise our next round of funding. And no matter how perfect the product is, if we don't have money in the bank, we can't scale. And other times there is no more important task than honestly being the pain in the ass CEO, or leader who is, sitting in, with your teams, looking at wireframes and trying to figure out what user feedback is telling you about, where the product may be breaking down in its journey to delight the customer, right? So the thing I think that is most important as you think about scaling yourself and your team is to think about, if nothing else, this one principle, which is, forego this idea that up and to the right is the journey of a leader and embrace the notion of operating range, which is your job is to be attuned to what the organization might need from you at any point in time, and to be willing to play those different roles, even if they're outside your comfort zone, because mostly it's your willingness and your attunement to where you need to go that is the difference between being a successful leader and not. It's not about being perfect at all these things. It's about leading the company and yourselves on a journey to be able to identify the hot spots of the business and move there and put your energy there, whatever that might mean. So what do I think about when I think about the job of a leader who wants to scale themselves and their team? I really think about it as a journey that incorporates a few different aspects. We talked about this notion of operating range. And so, zooming back, what I say to people when I talk about operating range is, do you have the capacity and the willingness to see the forest and the trees? Not the forest or the trees, the forest and the trees. And I liken being a leader to sort of having your bifocals on. I don't have bifocals, but I always imagine that for people who do, there are two lenses, right? There's the short term and there's sort of the far lens. And they're actually sitting inside the same set of glasses. And what you really need to do is know when to look down and when to look up, when to look far and when to look close. And I think if you want to sort of think about this notion of operating range in one very simple way, I would say it is the ability of a leader to really think about the forest and the trees, and to be willing to sort of, as we talked about, keep shifting their sight and what they're looking at, short and far, near, details and high. And so I think this notion of the forest and the trees is really the way I kind of encapsulate a leader's job. But when we talk about being a leader, I think and we talk about those quadrants I just showed you and the notion of operating range, it always starts with one thing, just one thing. And I think this is the thing that whenever I do kind of talks, whether it's to MBA students or to growth CEOs, I ask this question. And unfortunately, we're in a webinar, so it's a little hard with the number of people we have on screen for me to bounce back and forth between a poll and this and the presentation. But normally, if I could see you all, and you were all in front of me, I would say one thing. I would say, raise your hand if you know your trademark strength. And typically, it doesn't matter who the room full of people is. When I ask that question, only about a third of the room puts up their hand. Sometimes I think that's false modesty, that everybody knows what they're great at and what their values are and what their innate strengths are versus the skills they've acquired. But if it's false modesty, it's really rather wasted, because if you want to be a leader and build an extraordinary company, you have to start not just with self-awareness, but I would say a unique perspective on what you're uniquely great at. As we talked about when we think about operating range, I don't expect that any leader, myself included, is great at everything in those four quadrants. What I expect is a great leader knows where, their core strength lies, and knows how to complement themselves and build teams around them that, I would say are domain experts or are equally outstanding at areas that they're not. And so when you navigate to different quadrants, again, your job as a leader is to navigate there and shine a lens on and, roll up your sleeves and dive deep with the team. But that doesn't mean you're expected to be a specialist in everything. It does mean you need to know where you uniquely are great, and what you need to complement yourself with in order to operate kind of I would just say a team that both scales and a team that has, all the required trademark strengths to really build something outstanding. So to the extent that any of you have false modesty and you said if one asked that question, you would never raise your hand, I'm going to suggest to you that the next time somebody asks you what your trademark strengths are, you not only think about them lightly, but you think about them deeply. And you're able to characterize yourself as a leader on 3 key dimensions. What you're innately gifted at, and comes very easily to you. Your superpowers in terms of skills that you've built. And then number 3, which we won't talk a lot about today, but is quite important, is your values. Because we live in a time, and we'll talk about that a little later towards the end of this presentation, people really expect us as leaders not only to be self-aware of what we're great at or not, but also increasingly, our teams expect us to espouse and be transparent about our own value system and the value system for our companies. One of the other things I think about for leaders, and again, it comes very much to where we started this presentation, is what I called ABR. What is the job of a leader and where do you spend your time? Many of us are tempted to spend all of our time, obviously, managing our companies, right? Managing our startups, right? Heads down, doing what's required to build, as we talked about, an exceptional experience. But leaders who scale do one other thing really well. They are extraordinary recruiters of talent. So if any of you have seen Glengarry Glen Ross, they would have said, always be closing. I always say to leaders, always be recruiting. And by that, I mean 2 things. Number 1, be on the lookout for talent and take meetings and kind of reach out for talent far before you need it. I think one of the things I've always prided myself on doing as an executive and as an entrepreneur both is when somebody introduces me to someone interesting and saying, hey, would you, Sukhinder, you should meet this person. I usually take the meeting. And I take the meeting because I know that even though I don't have a role today for that person, when I have a role, I want to have in my mind already 3 or 4 people who could fill it. Other times, of course, it's only when we meet people that we actually identify that there's a gap in our own companies and opportunistically make hires. But the third thing that we ought to do as leaders is not be afraid to use our leadership or kind of executive gravitas to help close any key role in the company. And sometimes those key roles are not the ones that report to you, right? They're as many of you know, our companies are built not just by executive teams. In fact, they're rarely built by executive teams. They're mostly built, by the teams that we kind of operate inside the company every day. And it may be that what is holding a company up from scaling is, missing a front-end engineer or needing to up level its UEX capabilities. Or it may be that a key salesperson or key sales leader is what you need to scale your enterprise SaaS product. So I think as a leader, our job is not only to be on the lookout for talent for ourselves, it's really to be willing to apply ourselves to helping recruit and close, what the key kind of gaps are in our companies, no matter what level, and help get them over the finish line. So I really think about recruiting as something that is underweighted in terms of the time leaders spend, particularly if there's not a rec open. But I think it's one of the most important things that leaders can do to help scale themselves. The other, I think, key challenge for many of us, myself included, is what I call this sort of CEO and founder as author versus CEO and author and founder as publisher. And I think one of the other key things that many of us will confront as we seek to scale ourselves and our team is what is our natural role? And again, how do we think about creating a system in which we are not the only authors or architects of everything that needs to be built? On the one hand, I've never built a company that doesn't have my own unique energy and perspective as a founder on the product and the vision and the consumer experience. And I think I myself would be sad if I ever was very far away from having a vision and a hands-on sense of what our customers want or what I want for the product. And I think of that as my author energy. Like I have for everything I've ever run, as you become a domain expert in that thing, you have more and more, and if you're the founder, even more so a vision for where the product should go that is uniquely, an experience should go that's uniquely informed by your role. But the danger is, of course, building a company that operates only with you as a central author in the story. And I think all too often we think scaling ourselves is about being sort of so all-knowing on everything, as opposed to figuring out when we want to be the publisher. The way I think about the publisher role is really thinking about how you allow authorship to happen inside your company and not be in the room at the moment of creation. If you were the person who went in the room, will always be looked at as the only creator. I think about the publisher as giving people other room to author. And often authorship happens better, to be honest, when leaders aren't in the room and everyone isn't sort of looking to them for the answers. But when we give space to others to author parts of a vision or a journey, and then, invite them to really bring us into that process. Now, if you're like me and you have a strong vision of your own for where you want to go, the idea of being bought into a process to review somebody else's vision at the very end is also pretty challenging. I know many people who think that their job, if they're creating something, a deck, a user design, a wireframe, a next vision architecture or next rev of the architecture of a product, are tempted then to do the opposing, which when given space, they want to create this perfect thing that they show to the founder, CEO, because of course they're afraid that if they've been given the task to author something, that it needs to look perfect. In fact, I think what many leaders want is a level of involvement, because for them, it's hard to not be the author, right? It is hard for leaders to not author. What they want is a level of involvement that gives them leverage and the ability to provide feedback without waiting until something is perfect for it to be shown to them. So in my own journey as a leader, I've struggled with this because I've been both a founder and I've been a professional CEO. And as we talked about, there are days I want to put my author hat on and I want to just drive the hell out of something because I have a very stubborn vision for how it should be done. And there are times that, I realize that if I continue to pursue that kind of style of leadership, I'll never build a company that can scale beyond myself. And so when forcing myself to be publisher, what I say to teams is, okay, look, you have this, I'm looking for this for you to take the first pass at it. Please don't bring it to me when it's fully baked, because what I don't want to do, given I'm somebody who has strong opinions, is at the end of your beautiful project, weigh in and give you sort of all of this distressing feedback. The converse is, I myself will have something to say, but I don't want to ruin your process of authorship. So when something's at 40 or 50% done, don't wait till it's perfect. Let's sit down and have a conversation. At that point, you've had plenty of room to author, and I feel like I can give feedback in a way that it will be welcome and constructive, as opposed to giving it at the end, where often for teams that have slaved over a project, a CEO or founder's feedback can feel absolutely destructive at the very end. So for those of you who are leaders, I think it's about how do you create space for authorship of others. For those of you who are seeking to lead, it's about how do you become an author and give leverage, obviously, to your leaders, but create a dynamic that allows for, leaders to also imprint their feedback onto any kind of work we produce. So the one other principle that I think and feel pretty strongly about that runs a little counterintuitive is what I call the you manage me or I manage you principle. Again, if I could see you all, I would say to you, and I'd ask for a show of hands and say, okay, how many of you think that your job as a leader is to manage others? Inevitably, 60, 70, 80% of a room puts up their hand. And I think that's a very natural way to think about leadership, right? We all think our job is to manage others. But one of the most leveraged and scalable ways to lead is to figure out how to put upon your teams kind of the opposing principle, which is, I can manage you or you can manage me. I often say to people, which would you prefer? And of course, if you think about it that way, most people would not prefer that I come down on them as a CEO and I'm always telling them what to do. Most people would prefer the reverse, which is actually to manage me. And over the years that I've been a leader, I've actually learned to prefer that too, right? Because left alone, my natural state when I enter any room is I will start managing. I will start sort of, again, letting go of all of that kind of CEO and founder energy and kind of directing all the traffic, right? You can say that's great because it gives me ultimate control. Again, it really doesn't scale, right? What I now find that I delight in and I really love is what I call the you manage me principle, which is, okay, if you want a world in which you as a leader feel like you can increasingly create and author a vision and bring it to fruition, and you are also kind of dealing with or reporting to a very highly opinionated founder CEO, it's far more empowering to walk into a room with your own vision, your own recommendations, your own agenda, and then get into a dialogue in which you can draw insight from the leader you're working for. And then when you walk away from that interaction, both people feel a lot better. And I often say this to people, when folks walk into my office and have no vision, they walk out with my vision because I always have an idea of what I want to get done. When people walk into my office or kind of, my booth or wherever I'm sitting, my hot desk, with their own vision, their own agenda, their own thoughts of how something should go, and are managing me, what they're really doing is saying, okay, Sukhinder, here's my starting point, or here's what I think. What do you think? And inviting me in sort of to provide insight, leverage, guidance, a debate, whatever it is, the value added discussion that then lets them move on, with hopefully a vision that is still 90, 80, 70% their own, but has on it, my leverage and thinking and the benefit of having had the debate. And what I love as a leader about that is when I have those interactions, I leave actually pretty fulfilled because the leverage for my own time is tremendous. So I would much rather have 10 conversations every day where people are bringing in their own vision and I'm getting to have a really rapid and fun interaction where I'm taking in a lot of information and we're having a debate and we both leave that and I can go on, and move to sort of the next area that I want to focus on. That is a way more leveraged interaction than the I manage you state of leadership. So I always say to people, and I try now that, I've been a leader for a while when I'm hiring people to say like, look, like this is really my expectation. Like you set up the Google Doc. You please send me an agenda for every time we're going to meet. Like you take the 5 minutes to put down and frame your thinking, before we actually, meet for coffee, because otherwise I'm going to do all the framing and this will go my way. And neither of us will actually feel that empowered in that interaction. I might feel empowered in the short term. I certainly don't feel empowered over the longer term in creating any kind of company where I'm not feeling completely burdened to having to drive everything and not really able to leverage all this amazing talent that I've hired. So I want to touch on a couple of things before we go to questions. One other job of leaders, as you all know, is if you want to scale, you need to figure out who you have around the table and who you let go of around the table. And who is using and what is using your time and your energy versus what's giving you energy. So I always say as a leader, if you want to identify where your problem areas are, whether it's people or topic, and you want to figure out kind of how to be more fulfilled, you need to think about your own energy gain and energy drain. I'm sure all of you can think about the situations and the people that give you energy drain, where you leave those interactions feeling frustrated, worried, like something is not quite right and you can't tell why, and other interactions where you gain energy every time you're in the room. So I think as a leader, one of the things I'd ask you to do if you're thinking about how to scale yourself is figure out how to spend obviously more of your time in situations that give you energy and less of your time in situations that drain your energy. And so being very aware of that energy balance. People don't scale well or make it very far when their entire kind of leadership journey is draining. People make it, remarkably far when they pay attention to putting themselves in scenarios and managing to scenarios where they have more energy gain than drain. And obviously managing unproductive scenarios by paying attention to what's draining your energy and the energy of the organization and not letting that issue lag. So hold on a second here. We've got a little bit of slide issue. There we go. I want to finish up on 2 or 3 key principles. Number one is the sort of notion of operating range, which we talked about. One of your key jobs as a leader is to know when to be heads up and heads down. This brings us all the way back to that first principle I was talking about operating range. And I think the thing that I found that most helps me do this is honestly being conscious of it. And by conscious, I mean sort of paying attention to where you were spending your time. And if you find yourself as someone who's naturally heads down, i.e. you want to spend your time in the products and in operations and in management, to create a practice where you force yourself to be heads up, looking out at the environment, at your competitors, at, you know, what's going on in kind of your sector, talking to people, you know, who are similarly situated in let's say other marketplaces that you can learn something from. And if you're the converse, which is somebody who naturally spends your time heads up, to really think about how and when you're going to structure your time to get deep and dive into the areas of the organization where you don't have enough insight, or your company, to really know what's going on at a level that can help you drive success. So mostly this is about active time management. I started at the beginning of this as saying that as a leader, your job is not just to know your trademark strengths and your superpowers, but it's also to know your value system. And I want to come back to this kind of topic here in the next couple minutes when I talk about this principle of what I call find your priest, claim your religion. Number one, find your priest. What do I mean by that? I mean, find the set of people, you know, professional mentors, coaches, a similarly situated executive at another company with whom you can share and be vulnerable. And often that's not your board, right? It's really someone who you trust, who has you know, who can be a reflection to you of your own strengths, capabilities, somebody with whom you can talk about your weaknesses, somebody who can really help you grapple with the things you might be kind of struggling with at a company or struggling with in terms of your own competencies. So the importance of finding a priest who's not your board, who's not your spouse, but someone with whom you feel a deep sense of trust is really, really important to sort of staying self-aware, but also kind of solving the things that you're not naturally great at. For your employees, for your teams, claiming your religion is equally important. I always say to people, there is nothing as powerful to a team than a leader who shows both humility, a willingness to sort of identify what their natural areas of strength and weakness are, you know, because that not only conveys confidence, but it helps build a team around you. And people are, I think, incredibly gracious when they see that a leader themselves is willing to sort of acknowledge what they're not great at. The other thing that teams are looking for their leaders is, what do you believe? We live in a world where, you know, if you expect to create a great companies are about cultures that have a value system, whatever that value system is, that is not just sort of, you know, paper, but that's both articulated and that people are willing to stand behind. So when I talk about claiming your religion, whatever it is that you are, both from a superpower, strengths, and value system and what you believe, we live in a time where if you want people to stay and grow, they don't just want all the hard benefits of being at a company. What they really want is a sense of inclusivity and a sense of clarity for what the company and you stand for. I want to leave you with this thought. When I think about being a leader, I often think about drafting as sort of my key principle, which is, you know, we talked about all of these things you can do to scale yourself and put yourself in a position where you have the bandwidth to look out ahead and sort of be on the kind of on your front foot, you know, with capacity that people expect you to be spending, looking at sort of at what it is you want to do. But drafting when you do next and putting your energy to sort of not towards nonlinear opportunities. The only way that happens, though, is with the principle of drafting, which is you have to be pulling the pack behind you. Being out far ahead of every other leader in your organization doesn't really scale. It's not scalable for them. It's not scalable for you, right? But if you think of yourself as moving as a pack, you know, and really drafting as the principle, what you're trying to do is create an environment that scales with you and moves with you and allows you to move out in front, sometimes in behind, but mostly as a drafting as a principle as a leader. So with that, what I'd love to do is wrap up. I know it's 9:28, but we've got a couple of minutes for questions. I'm sorry we don't have a little bit more. But if that's okay, what I'm going to do is stop sharing and try and pull up Slido if we can. All right, so I'm hoping folks can see my, I'm going to share my screen again as we just go over to Slido here. Oops, apologies. Okay, so the questions I've got on Slido, aside from bonus and equity, how do you motivate the team in a startup environment, knowing startups struggle with money? I think my answer to that would be a couple of fold. First and foremost, I think as we talked about, you know, bonuses and equity go so far. What a team really wants to feel in a startup is participation and alignment, and like a sense that every day that the work they're doing is impactful. And how do you create that? I think you create that by being kind of, in some ways, very flat and creating a pretty efficient, I would say, system where everybody can participate in things like OKR as an example. And you do it by sharing things like values. And so I think if you look at just bonus and equity, what you want to do is align people very quickly in a startup. That's why people go to a startup. They go for speed, they go for alignment, and they go for impact, right? And they go for some sense of mission and purpose. And so I think what you want to do is create the fastest, quickest, imperfect systems to bind everyone together quickly. How do you do an OKR session for the next quarter in a couple of hours? How to create a structure where everybody feels like they can participate super quickly. How do you get people in a room every week, or virtually? I mean, at StubHub, obviously, we were not a startup, but in the COVID era, we were doing hands-on, all hands weekly, and sometimes a couple of times a week, where we bound everybody together very quickly to actually create OKRs to manage through that time. The other thing I think I only have time for about one more question, so let me pick up one more. As you're a solo founder, looking to build your leadership team, where should you go first to start building these relationships and finding people? Incredibly, I think you'll find that there are two sources for you of great talent. Number one is other founders and your network of people you've previously worked with closely at bigger companies. So I would say, and then number two is sort of working LinkedIn, but LinkedIn is only useful insofar as you do the first. So I would say finding yourself a set of similarly situated founders, through, and even if you don't know them, I think you will quickly find that you can share both leads and thoughts, because you're both out building your teams, hopefully in a non-competitive environment. And number two, always your previous network of who you've worked with, even at large companies. So with that, I think I am out of time. There are a bunch more questions. I'm sorry I don't have a chance to answer them all, but happy to pick up with some of you on LinkedIn. If you want to ping me on LinkedIn, I would happily try and answer your questions one-on-one there. And with that, I want to thank you kind of very much for having me.